Behind every collection is a collector, and every collector has a story. Mine began back in 1987 when I got my Nintendo Entertainment System, but I'd say that I didn't become a collector until 2006. Shortly after I began collecting Nintendo systems and games, I began to get nostalgic and I wrote down all my Nintendo-related memories in a piece I called My Nintendo Narrative. I wrote it for fun and never intended for it to have an audience. In recent years, however, I've watched videos from various members of the YouTube gaming community in which they recount their own memories and experiences collecting throughout the years. Several of my subscribers have suggested that I do the same. Although I can't promise it'll be all that entertaining, nor do I pretend to be so narcissistic as to think that many people would actually be all that interested, I present to you my Nintendo narrative.
What's it like to play the Nintendo Entertainment System? The Nintendo Entertainment System. Now you're playing with power.
I can remember watching the house blast off into outer space, and that weird guy in spandex calling Zelda in the first Nintendo commercials as a kid back in 1986. The robot? The gun? That thing must cost a lot of money, I thought. Strangely enough, I wasn't really all that interested. I was, after all, still playing with my Masters of the Universe figures. A few years later, I was surprised to hear on the bus on the way to school one morning that a friend of a friend had gotten Nintendo for his birthday. I was mildly interested. One day after school, I ended up at his house with our mutual friend and we played Super Mario Bros. I can honestly say that I wasn't all that intrigued. It was fun, and the staircase to the flagpole reminded me a lot of a chocolate bar, but I was indifferent. I was more interested in some games that I had played at another friend's house. Skiing and Venturon in television, and Smurfs on ColecoVision held my interest, and it was the latter that I decided that I wanted for my 8th birthday. Little did I know that it would be just a little difficult to find. Phone calls to Venture, KB Toys, Babbage's, and Kmart were answered by puzzled salespeople who had no idea what I was talking about. I didn't know that in 1987, ColecoVision had been out of production for nearly 3 years. Since I wasn't getting any results, and neither was my poor mother, who was also searching high and low for my perfect birthday gift, my parents began to plant the seed in my head that I just might have to settle for that Nintendo thing I saw at my friend's house. While shopping at Venture one evening with my family, we saw it on display. "What's Nintendo?" my dad asked. "Nintendo," I corrected him. "It's the game system my friend has." There was a tinge of excitement in my voice. You know, the kind a kid has at the prospect of getting a new toy. My dad and I joked a couple of times throughout the years about his mispronunciation of Nintendo. He remembers it to this day. And as a Spanish teacher now, I'm amused to realize that ni entiendo, or ni entiendo, in Spanish means, I don't even understand. As I began to tear off the wrapping paper on my birthday in 1987, I wondered to myself if my parents had come through for me with that ColecoVision, or if I'd soon be playing with power. Power it was. As she saw my face, my mother apologetically explained that ColecoVision just wasn't available anymore. Too bad eBay hadn't yet come to fruition, right? She said the salesman at Venture where she bought the Nintendo assured her that this was the next big thing, and that it was actually a lot better than ColecoVision. I didn't want to believe her. After all, just look at that controller. It was so complicated. 2 buttons, and that weird cross thing. Well, I had no choice, so we began to hook it up to the only TV in the house. A 19-inch Sony Trinitron with wood grain accents. Deep down inside, though, I was excited. Despite my excitement, I vocalized my gripe about the complicated controller when the little man failed to jump after I pressed up on the cross key. Up should jump, right? Apparently not. I had already put the game in the system and began playing before my dad could force me to read all the manuals cover to cover as he suggested. After I finally did resort to the manual and, among other things, learned to press A to jump, the game became a lot more fun, and I became familiar with that liquid-smooth Mario platform and control. We were a family of modest means, and like most kids, I usually got new games only on my birthday and Christmas. Such would be the pattern for the next 15 years or so. Wild Gunman, the Zapper, and a subscription to the Nintendo Fun Club News, which later became Nintendo Power, were Christmas gifts in 1987. There were occasions when I saved up the $40 to purchase a new game on my own. To my recollection, Castlevania and Kid Nicky were two of those games. Despite my reluctance to accept the new system, I did realize how lucky I was to have it. I was the only one I knew, save for that one friend of a friend, who later did become my friend, that actually had the NES. Soon after, however, one by one, my friends got theirs. Playdates were made, sleepovers were had, and new games were discovered, borrowed, and purchased. There is an interesting story about how I first got my hands on The Legend of Zelda. My parents and I had just gotten back from a restaurant, and my friend, the same one with the ColecoVision, who now had Nintendo, called to set up a playdate for the following day. He mentioned that he may get a new game and listed The Legend of Zelda among the possibilities. I wanted that game. I had played it at a friend's house only a couple times, but it drew me in just the same. This was the only time I can remember pitching a fit and whining to my parents. It really wasn't something I did often or at all, but after my fit, I went up to my room to cool off. Minutes later, I turned around to see my dog, Ruby, standing inside the door with a copy of The Legend of Zelda in her mouth. To this day, I still don't know why my mom had bought the game or why she thought my behavior warranted receiving it at that moment, but I didn't care. That legendary gold cartridge was mine. Unfortunately, it would perish a few years later while in the possession of one of my friends to whom I lent it. I know it wasn't his fault that the battery inside the game pack happened to die while he had it, but it sure was frustrating to have a broken game returned to me. The packaging hung around the basement in a box for quite a while, but I no longer have it, nor do I recall when I got rid of it. For my 9th birthday in 1988, I received the long-awaited Super Mario Bros. 2, but not without a hitch. My mom thought she'd be clever and wrap the game and then place it in another wrapped box, the size it's usually used to give clothing. Man, 2 birthdays in a row tinged by disappointment. My disappointment would soon turn to glee as I discovered the other wrapped gift inside that had the dimensions of a Nintendo game. Sure enough, Super Mario Bros. 2. On my birthday, a year later, I would receive the Power Pad packaged with world-class track meet. Christmas of that year would bring me Commando and another title for the Power Pad, Super Team Games. The manual recommends that the Power Pad be used only as directed for a reason. Mine was not long for this world after my friends and I used our fists instead of our feet to alternately pound on the sensors. To Child World, Mom and I went back to exchange it as defective. Back then, I guess the strict video game return policies of today had not yet been established, as I was not required to exchange it for the same item. Instead, I came home with a Game Boy. I would soon be Tetrisized. Just as with my Nintendo, the frequency at which I got new Game Boy games was only 2 to 3 times a year. My original Game Boy collection never amassed more than Tetris, the pack-in game, Super Mario Land, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, The Fall of the Foot Clan, and baseball, which I got for Easter, as I usually received one gift for Easter. Speaking of more gifts, for my 11th birthday in 1990, my parents gave me the NES Max controller and Super Mario Bros. 3. I had played Super Mario Bros. 3 so much at a friend's house that I decided to exchange it for Dick Tracy, a game that I had rented recently. I really enjoyed the movie, and I liked the game a lot too, so for me at the time, it was a good choice. As with all my other games, however, my interest in it faded over time. A friend who came to my birthday party that year also gave me a game called Demon's Sword. Everyone at the party was amazed to see an NES game given as a gift. I enjoyed playing my NES and Game Boy, but was by no means a power player. The number of games I've actually beaten can probably be counted on a couple of hands. Games, for some reason, intimidated me, and I was content just to play them until I was bored and then be done. Perhaps this was why, on the date of that fateful garage sale in 1991, the idea of selling games I no longer played sounded so appealing. I wish I had known then that this behavior would soon become a habit that I would later regret. One lucky mom who came to our garage sale made off with my Game Boy and games, as well as a few NES games, Commando, Kid Nicky, Castlevania, and Jaws, which was an Easter gift when I was really hoping for Metroid. I was left with Deja Vu, which I traded my friend for a Super Mario Bros. 3 cartridge, Super Mario Bros., Super Mario Bros. 2, Wild Gunman, and Dick Tracy. The last four on the list are still part of my complete in-box collection today. I think the idea of making money and the fact that I was starting to hear about the new 16-bit consoles were the reasons why I was eager to rid myself of the games. I had seen Ghouls and Ghosts on the SEGA Genesis at the house of a friend's friend. Wow, it looked a whole lot better than Ghosts and Goblins on the NES. It was then that I began to realize that the NES was not going to last forever. Shortly after that, my friend, the same one at whose house I first played the NES, received a SEGA Genesis packed with Altered Beast for his birthday. At the time, Sega was offering a promotion in which the proof of purchase from the SEGA Genesis Altered Beast package could be sent in and redeemed for a free copy of Sega's newest game. My friend had done just that and called me over the afternoon it arrived so I could check it out. Wow, the bright, vibrant colors, the catchy synthesized music, that attitude, the speed. Sonic the Hedgehog was totally awesome. I was definitely ready to pass my NES on to my little brother and graduate to the 16-bit generation. Now that I'd seen Sonic the Hedgehog, however, I was faced with a very tough decision. Should I get a SEGA Genesis so I could play Sonic? Or should I stick to what I knew and loved in the form of the Super NES, which was to be released later in 1991? I used the limited information provided by the Sears Wishbook catalog so I could compare specs and game libraries for each system. I'd mull the decision over and over and change my mind several times until one evening when I finally got to play Super Mario World at a store display in the electronics department at Walmart. That was it. Being able to ride a dinosaur and lap up Koopas with his tongue sealed the deal. Although my friend would try to persuade me otherwise, arguing that we could trade games if I got a SEGA Genesis, I decided that I would get a Super NES for my 12th birthday and finally graduate to the 16-bit generation of game consoles. Graduation would come with a hefty $200 price tag, though. If I wanted a Super NES for my 12th birthday, I'd have to strike up a little deal with my parents. My parents explained that a $200 gift was a bit extravagant for a 12-year-old, and that I'd have to pay half if I wanted it for my birthday. And so the saving began. By the system's release in the fall of 1991, I had saved up my share. I was ready. The problem was that my birthday wasn't until December. I was afraid stores would sell out before I could get one, so I made an agreement with my parents that I wouldn't play it until my birthday in December if I could get it early. The ploy worked, and my mom and I went to Walmart shortly after Thanksgiving to make the purchase. I can still remember the entire stack of them they had sitting right there in the middle of the floor of the electronics department. I couldn't even wait to get home. I had the thing open in the car. I wanted to see how that mysterious eject button worked, and if the cross key on the new controller was made of rubber as it had appeared in the photos I had seen. As we neared the house, I packaged it up carefully and prepared to uphold the agreement. Yeah, right. I can remember playing it secretly up in my room on a little black and white TV. I soon realized, though, that my parents actually didn't care that I played it early. They weren't going to have it in the house only to torture me. And so the Super NES was brought out of hiding to live in the basement with my NES. Hooking the two systems up to the same TV was such a cool idea. Sadly, this would be the last Nintendo system that would include not only a game and two controllers, but also all the necessary cables to hook it up. Ah, the good old days. Anyway, now that I had my new Super NES, I needed to renew my subscription to Nintendo Power, as I had let the initial subscription expire after a year. This renewal would take me through the next couple of years until I let it expire again after 1995. The games I acquired for the Super NES were still few and far between. This was partially due to the fact that there just weren't many games I wanted, especially at the beginning of the system's life. Ultraman was the only one that had piqued my interest. I requested it for Christmas and happened to rent it just before. Luckily, I found out that it was a better rental than a purchase, so Mom and I went back to Walmart the day after Christmas to exchange it. I wasn't interested in Pilot Wings or F-Zero at the time. I love them now. So I got what would be my last store-bought game for the NES, Tom and Jerry. It was a good game, but I was disappointed that I wouldn't have anything new for my Super NES that year. I lived 6 months on the Super Mario World pack-in game before purchasing The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past in May of 1992 from KB Toys with my own money. I would later sell it along with the player's guide to a friend in September of that same year. Christmas gifts of Mario Paint and Super Mario Kart would follow, along with the ASCII Pad turbo controller. The next purchase I would make with birthday and Christmas money would be Street Fighter II in January of 1993. That game would hold me over through the notorious dry spell the Super NES experienced that year. The only other titles of note, in my opinion, were Star Fox and Super Mario All-Stars. They're both valued pieces in my collection now, but for reasons unknown, I wasn't interested in owning them when they came out. It was also in 1993 that my NES was packed up in its box to wait for its future owner, my brother, to come of age and begin to play. It wasn't long, however, before he had pulled the console from the table to its demise on the floor. The console was discarded and the controllers lost, but the box and instruction manual would live on. Sometimes they'd be in the basement and others in the garage, but they somehow managed to survive all those years until I reclaimed them. They're now among the few original pieces in my collection. The console, controllers, and cables have all been replaced. The first of very few times I would stray from Nintendo products occurred in 1993 under the influence of one of my friends who had just bought a SEGA Genesis. I had always liked Sonic the Hedgehog. For me, that game was the only reason there was a choice to be made between buying the Super NES versus the SEGA Genesis back in 1991, just as Sega's marketing department had intended. Unfortunately for Sega, at that time, I opted for the familiar path. The lack of quality titles from Nintendo in 1993, coupled with a clever marketing ploy from Sega, persuaded my friend to get the Genesis. It was the 2 free games deal. Buy the Genesis packaged with Sonic the Hedgehog, and send away to get Sonic the Hedgehog 2 by mail. It was awesome! It was such a deal that I gave in to the pressure from my friend and put the money I was saving to buy Street Fighter II Turbo towards the new Genesis. To Babbage's we went the morning after one of our sleepovers, and I got my first non-Nintendo system. It was the redesigned Genesis packaged with Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Finally, I could experience this blast processing Sega was hyping. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 was a great game, but my lack of patience to develop any skill made the novelty of owning a Genesis wear off quickly. I decided I should just stick with the Super NES, as I already had a small library of quality games for it. I also yearned for the new characters and moves Street Fighter II Turbo promised. Back to Babbage's to get a store credit for when it was released. To use up the remaining balance, I purchased controller extension cables and another ASCII turbo pad for my friends who always complained that I had the unfair advantage of a turbo controller when we played Street Fighter II. It's been a while since I mentioned a birthday. It should be noted that my 13th and 14th birthdays in 1992 and 1993, respectively, marked the first time since 1987 that I didn't ask for a Nintendo product as a gift. It was a sign that I was growing up and that my interests were shifting towards music. From 1992 to 1995, my birthday gifts were components to a Sony stereo system I was building. It wouldn't be until 1996 that I would ask for Mortal Kombat Trilogy for the Nintendo 64 as a birthday gift. One of the last Super Nintendo games I would receive as a gift would be Aladdin for Christmas of 1993. Nintendo managed to revive itself after the game drought of 1993. A stream of superb titles would hit the Super NES during 1994. Among those were Super Metroid, Super Punch-Out, Donkey Kong Country, and Final Fantasy III. Despite the abundance of great games, only one caught my attention thanks to a promotional video that arrived at my doorstep courtesy of my dwindling subscription to Nintendo Power. Donkey Kong Country would be the last Super NES game I would receive as a birthday gift. I was actually expecting it for Christmas, but it accompanied the tape deck component to my stereo that I asked for. More excellent games would be on the way in 1995 and 1996. These included Chrono Trigger, Yoshi's Island, Super Mario RPG, and Donkey Kong Country sequels. Much like my lack of interest in Pilot Wings and F-Zero back in 1991, these games failed to interest me. I knew about them only because of the issues of Nintendo Power that kept arriving month after month. My subscription would finally expire at the end of 1995, and I decided not to renew because each issue received little to no attention before it was cast aside. My lack of interest in Nintendo could only be attributed to my new hobby, collecting CDs and making mixtapes of my favorite music. My interest in Nintendo during 1996 continued to fade until I heard the news that the N64 would be released in September. My subscription to Nintendo Power had expired, so I don't even remember how I heard about it. More amazing was the relatively short time span between when I first heard of its release, decided I was going to get it, and finally did get it on launch day. I still have the desktop wallpaper I made of the N64 logo on Microsoft Paint that I made a few days prior to the system's release. In hindsight, it was an incredible feat to secure the console on release day, as it was available in extremely limited quantities. I didn't even know what I was up against at the time. I had never been a doorbuster, and I didn't know of the system's limited availability. I did, however, know that I would have to get up early that Sunday morning. I was so excited, though, that it was more a matter of staying up rather than getting up. I didn't sleep very well that night. Regardless, I was first or second in line at Target bright and early that sunny autumn morning. I got in, got my console and copy of Super Mario 64, and got out in less than 10 minutes. My mom was hosting a dinner for the neighbors at our house that night, and I was having friends over. I was pumped that we were going to be able to play Super Mario 64. Everyone thought it was awesome. One of my friends even got his hands on an N64 and Super Mario 64 within the next week or so. He was determined to get all 120 Power Stars. I took a more relaxed approach, as usual, and played the game casually until I got bored or frustrated. I was happy just running around the castle grounds. The play control was so liberating, and the moves you could pull off with such minimal effort were impressive. I didn't know it at the time, but Super Mario 64 would eventually become my favorite game of all time. I played Super Mario 64 on and off through the autumn and winter months of 1996, until it was joined by my next N64 game, Mortal Kombat Trilogy. I received this game as another early birthday gift. I can remember going to Babbage's at the mall on the scheduled release day, only to be told it wasn't yet available. Oh, the days without internet updates. I relied on magazines such as Next Generation for game news and reviews. Oddly enough, it was that magazine that would play a large part in my decision to eventually abandon the N64. As per usual, a group of friends spent the night for my 17th birthday celebration. This time, however, we would be camping out up in my room instead of down in the basement. The bed was stowed, TVs were brought in, and Taco Bell was ordered. Friends brought their consoles, and we set up various game stations. Given their 4-player feature, I thought Wave Race 64 and Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey would be good titles to rent for the occasion. The party was a hit, and by the end of the year, Killer Instinct Gold for Christmas, as well as rain checks for 3 additional black N64 controllers, would be added to the collection. I would also purchase the controller pack from KB Toys with my own money. 1997 for the N64 was much like 1993 for the Super NES. Very few quality games were produced, and those that were of substance were available near the beginning of the year. Wave Race 64 was technically released in 1996, but it wasn't easily available until later in 1997. I snagged my copy from a very high shelf behind the counter at Funcoland for the hefty price of $100. Talk about supply and demand. After renting it for my birthday party, it haunted my subconscious, and it was just one of those titles I knew I had to have. Along with Super Mario 64, it remains one of my most favorite titles of all time. In addition to the ones I play, I have a sealed copy of these two games as well as Killer Instinct Gold. Other titles I purchased early on in 1997 were Mario Kart 64 and Turok Dinosaur Hunter. Both of these were among the few outstanding games available at the time on the N64. As winter melted into spring and spring warmed to summer, I played my games and continued to read Next Generation magazine. Unlike Nintendo Power, whose subscription I did not renew upon acquiring the N64, this was a non-biased magazine that told things like they were. The writers gratuitously praised the N64 for its successes, such as Super Mario 64 and Wave Race 64, but were also quick to criticize its faults. The most notable of these were its lack of games. I remember reading the huge 1996 year-end bonus issue, which I still have, over and over again. It pitted the Sony PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and N64 against each other in an article titled The Big Fight. I love the article because it detailed each system's specifications, library of current and future games, and showed cool photos of their internals. The writers of the article awarded the N64 4 stars and labeled it very likely to succeed. This prognosis would soon turn negative as complaints of the old-fashioned cartridges and lack of quality games continued to mount. I reluctantly began to agree with the criticism as I too noticed the poor sound quality and play control of a lot of third-party games. I also preferred Super Mario Kart on the Super NES to Mario Kart 64. Well, if I preferred what I already had on the Super NES, why continue on with the N64? It wasn't until I received the May 1997 issue of Next Generation magazine that I seriously began to question the console. On the cover of that issue, it boldly stated, "There's something wrong with Nintendo 64." The last game I purchased for the N64 was Mace: The Dark Age in late summer, early fall of 1997. I always had a fondness for fighting games thanks to Street Fighter II. My friends were all playing Tekken 2 on PlayStation. Since I couldn't own Tekken, and the pictures I saw in Next Generation of Mace were absolutely gorgeous, it seemed like a good choice. Actually, it was really one of the only choices as far as fighters went on the N64. But like other N64 games, especially the third-party ones, the problems were clunky controls and mediocre music. That was about it for me with the N64. Ironically, it was also around this time that I bought a PlayStation. As a lot of my friends already had it, this purchase was purely the result of boredom and peer influence. I did enjoy Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo and what I played of Castlevania Symphony of the Night and Final Fantasy VII, but the PlayStation entertained me far less than the N64, especially compared to my adventures with Super Mario 64. There were not any games I wanted for my birthday or Christmas for 1997, and my interest in the N64 slowed to a trickle. In the meantime, I continued to maintain my music collection. For my birthday, I added a Sony mini-disc player to the stereo system. Christmas, strangely enough, would yield 3 Super NES games: Killer Instinct, F-Zero, and Tetris and Dr. Mario. The last 2 were Player's Choice reissues that I would upgrade to the originals sometime later. Super NES games were on clearance at Best Buy at the time, and I was feeling retro, so I put them on my list. Had I known how valuable of a collector's piece Earthbound would become, I also would have bought every single copy that they had marked down to $25. Oh, the benefits of hindsight. By late December 1997, my lack of interest in gaming and the negative hype on the N64 from Next Generation magazine led me to sell my N64 and games to a friend who expressed an interest in them. After my regrettable decision to sell my launch N64, I went on Nintendo hiatus from the end of 1997 through fall of 2002. Early on during those 5 years, I remember one of my friends noticed that I was no longer up on what was going on in the video game world. He made a comment that I was missing out on a lot of good games. He was definitely right. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time and Donkey Kong 64, just to name a couple. Regardless, his remark didn't faze me. I did a lot of growing up in those 5 years, and video games were of little appeal to me. The only thing that remained constant was my Super NES and collection of about 12 games that I had for it. It stayed connected to my TV during my absence from Nintendo, and I did play my games from time to time, mostly Tetris and Dr. Mario. I didn't realize it then, but the Super NES appealed to me so much because of the simplicity of the games. I'm not a hardcore gamer, and I've always enjoyed the pick-up-and-play aspect of so many of my games. Case in point, Super Castlevania IV for Super NES versus Castlevania Symphony of the Night for PlayStation. The objective of the former is to jump and swing your whip to advance through the linear stages. The latter adds RPG elements that introduce a learning curve and require a bit more commitment on the part of the player. I don't care for that. I prefer a minimal learning curve and small time commitment. Those were the qualities my Super NES games afforded me, and they were those that I enjoyed playing. I also remained faithful to the Super NES because of the fond memories I had, and because it was the first of my possessions of which I made a conscious effort to take extremely good care. Throughout the years, I remember feeling nostalgic seeing my brother play on various generations of gaming consoles. From his first encounter with my NES, which he broke, through the Xbox 360, he has played quite a bit. Some of the consoles in his collection were Nintendo, but most were not. He used FuncoLand, now GameStop, as a source to get many of his consoles used. It actually turned out that my mom was upset that I sold my N64. She would have preferred to buy it from me for my brother to use. Oh well. To try to patch things over, I gave him the PlayStation that lay dormant in my room. I think he was about 8 or 9 at the time, and the PlayStation didn't suit his taste in games very well. The N64 would have been a better fit for him as it offered similarly themed games as his green Game Boy Pocket, which I frequently borrowed to play Tetris. He would eventually get an N64 from GameStop, and after that, a Game Boy Advance, a PS2, an Xbox, and finally an Xbox 360. For Christmas 2001, probably somewhere in between PS2 and Xbox, he got GameCube. I smile as it took me back to my Nintendo days as a kid. Little did I know that I too would soon be returning to Nintendo, and probably for good. While staying at my parents' house for winter break in January 2002, my brother's little jet black GameCube intrigued me. I didn't much care for Luigi's Mansion, but I knew there was a new iteration of Wave Race 64 entitled Wave Race Blue Storm. I decided to rent it from Blockbuster and play it on his GameCube. The graphics were beautiful, but the music and play control just weren't the same. I love the game today, but it's still second to the N64 version in my opinion. Blue Storm wasn't enough to entice me to buy a GameCube of my own, though. It would take Mario to pique my interest yet again. I was shopping at Target one fall afternoon in 2002 and saw a playable demo of Super Mario Sunshine. Wow, was it pretty. I was amazed at how I was able to pick up the controller and move Mario around like a pro because the play control was so akin to that of Super Mario 64. I left the store without giving it much further thought, but that satisfying play control lingered in my subconscious for weeks. It wasn't long before I realized I had to play Sunshine. It hadn't yet been released, but that didn't mean I couldn't pick up the GameCube using the 10% discount I got for opening a new Target Visa account. Along with the console, ironically enough, I purchased Wave Race Blue Storm. Super Mario Sunshine would come in the mail a few weeks later, bundled with a memory card, the player's guide, and the first issue of my renewed subscription to Nintendo Power. I was back! Super Mario Sunshine was just as much fun as Super Mario 64, but like many players, I missed the variety in locales. Everything in Sunshine took place in a tropical setting, which was actually quite fitting given the game's theme. Regardless, much like my opinion on Wave Race titles, Super Mario Sunshine will always come in a close second behind Super Mario 64. A short time later, I began my teaching career and was able to add titles to my GameCube collection with much more regularity than I was to my N64 collection as a high school student. Around this time, I also picked up a Game Boy Advance SP so I could play Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo. A few years later, I bought a DS to play Nintendogs. The only problem was that I still didn't play my games all that much. This bothered me. Why did I enjoy buying games that I knew I probably would not ever complete or even play very much? During the GameCube era, I realized something about myself. Despite the fact that I'm not a hardcore gamer, Nintendo has been a constant in my life since 1987. I first got an NES because it was the popular gift for kids my age at the time. From that point on, Nintendo games have always held my interest to varying degrees. While playing Super Smash Bros. Melee on the GameCube and Tetris DS on the Nintendo DS, I continually impressed myself, not because of my skill level, but because of my ability to recognize the many obscure instances of fan service that Nintendo included in those games. I felt a sense of ownership over Nintendo, as if I was one of the lucky few, million that is, that was there from the beginning. For me, collecting has become a hobby that has the added benefit of gaming. When I'm in the mood for a gaming experience, only Nintendo games provide the simple, lighthearted entertainment that I'm looking for. For the most part, however, I just enjoy watching my collection expand. This may sound strange to many gamers, but if you think about it, coin collectors don't spend their coins, and stamp collectors don't use their stamps to mail letters. Like any collector, I get a thrill out of placing the latest edition of a Nintendo franchise on the shelf with the others. Of all video game platforms, I believe Nintendo is the most fun to collect because of the nostalgia factor, its novelty products, and its numerous game series such as Mario, Zelda, and Metroid. Since January 2006, my Nintendo collection has grown exponentially courtesy of eBay. I continue to collect games I used to have or those that I always wanted. I currently own every Nintendo console and portable as well as rarities such as ROB and Virtual Boy. My criteria for buying Nintendo products are that they be new and sealed, or open but 100% complete and in like new condition. When necessary, I piece together game components, box, cartridge, manual, inserts, etc. to complete a set in acceptable condition. I collect only first editions of Super NES, N64, and GameCube games, not Player's Choice reissues. My goal is to complete collections of various Nintendo game series across all Nintendo platforms. On occasion, I pick up promotional products such as in-store displays and even playable demo units. I also love game music and have a variety of Nintendo soundtracks on CD. My subscription to Nintendo Power was renewed for good in April 2006, and I acquired the rest of the missing issues through the Nintendo website and on eBay in December of that year. I monitor eBay frequently and track my collecting progress in a spreadsheet. Thanks to my renewed interest in Nintendo, I'll never again pay the collector's price for an item on eBay, as I eagerly await any and all new Nintendo products on their release day. At 12 a.m. on Sunday, November 19, 2006, I was one of the first in line for GameStop's midnight release of the Wii. I don't consider myself to be a gamer or a Nintendo fanboy, as I recognize great games on non-Nintendo systems as well. I don't pay attention to the console wars, and I certainly don't care if Nintendo wins over Sony, Microsoft, or whoever the competition may be. All that matters to me is that Nintendo continued to produce the same quality, innovative products that have intrigued me since 1987. I'm a Nintendo collector. I don't play with power, I collect it. Few others can play Sonic the Hedgehog from the Sonic Mega Collection for GameCube on the Wii using an original Super NES controller. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my Nintendo narrative, and I want to thank all of you who offered positive feedback and support in the comments. I know you may feel as if the story is incomplete since there was no mention of the 3DS or Wii U. As I said in the introduction to this series, though, I wrote my Nintendo narrative shortly after I began collecting so I could have a record of my Nintendo-related memories. Any collecting I did since the Wii has been and will continue to be documented on my YouTube channel. So after hearing my story, I hope you were able to recall some warm, fuzzy gaming memories of your own. After all, every collector's story is essentially the same, save for the dates and names of consoles and games.